Before beginning my presentation, I must clarify my title and what I seek to put forward. I must also apologize because this is still a work in progress. It is indeed a question of thinking about the relations that philosophy and mathematics can entertain. And you all know here that these relations, which seem so vital to us, are often stormy, or at least do not go without question. However, it is often claimed that mathematics and philosophy are intimately connected, often to say that philosophy is eternally indebted to mathematics, and therefore that mathematics is dominant over philosophy. I could give here two classical configurations where philosophy is dependent on mathematics. The first one consists in thinking that mathematics is the best way to access a certain ideality or sometimes a reality. We have already mentioned that before. In this case, any philosophy can only be thought by taking support from mathematics, and in turn has access to this ideality or reality only through mathematical mediation. I don't want to develop these aspects here, and behind ideality or reality, which seems to oppose each other, I put various situations that you may think of. There is a second relative positioning of philosophy and mathematics, which consists in seeing philosophy as a limit proposition of mathematics. That is to say, to think that we can rely on the synoptic force of the whatever element of the whole object of mathematics to transcend it into a synoptic capacity proper to philosophy, capable of grasping the whole thing, where, of course, here the thing would be opposed to the object in that it is neither conducive to being grasped by any single structure, nor by any formalized language of logic. I make this diversion, as you will see, because there is an echo with what follows. But back to my title. The word shadow that I use in the title of my talk is meant to be quite positive here, and a way of seeing how the philosopher can benefit again from a proximity to mathematics, but a proximity that is chosen, mobile, adapted to our own purposes. Indeed, any philosophy of mathematics is inexorably obstructed by the dominant position of mathematics in our world. This is coupled with a galloping progression of mathematics. And when I say progression, I mean, in fact, different things, mainly two things. First, on the one hand, there is a progression as defined by mathematicians, which is measured by a certain number of criteria. The progression of mathematics, in the sense of mathematicians, is acted upon by a process of validation by a part of the research community. It is essentially linked to the notion of what is new, a novelty that can be verified by comparison what was already has been already published, based on the ability to recognize two equivalent statements, to clarify two results in the same field, to classify, two results in the same field from the point of view of their greater or lesser generality. Generality understood here in terms of the situations that fall under that or that theorem or proposition, or sometimes by noting that a new result completes an existing theorem and extends its scope. To be precise, we must add a notion of economy of proof. Results are re-demonstrated in a different way, and there comes into play values such as the length of the demonstration, simplicity, aesthetics, criteria of adaptability to other situations. In other words, this is all about the generality of the proof, which is different from the type of generality that I mentioned just before. Finally, new results are considered more or less important, more or less difficult, innovative, and these evaluations are used to distinguish both published mathematics and, in a sense, mathematicians themselves. Faced with this heavy artillery and the unshakable evidence of certain criteria put forward, philosophy seems to be quite helpless, and wanting to question or even rethink the progression of mathematics becomes a real challenge. However, this is a question that seems to me to be essential for any philosophy that deals with mathematics, as it must lead to a distinct approach to the notion of progression. More precisely, there are two tasks that I think philosophy should be assigned. The first one, which is a priority, consists in a critique of mathematical reason that allows us to establish the very conditions of mathematical thought and its progression, that is, freed from the definition given by mathematicians themselves. This is the second point, the second way of seeing the progression that I mentioned just a few minutes ago. The second task consists in determining the work of the judgments that accompany mathematics in agenda, and of which I recall some important aspects above. In other words, it is a question of understanding how two types of progressions are articulated to see the points that they share or what strongly distinguishes them. The philosopher is herself subject to this idea of progression, and working with Grothendieck fully illustrates the difficulty that philosophy is then faced with. What I have just said shows, in my opinion, something essential, which is the necessity of a clear positioning between philosophy of mathematics, if you wish, and mathematics. The imperative here is to defend the necessary autonomy of philosophy with respect to mathematics. For philosophy of mathematics to exist, it is necessary to be able to maintain a distance between philosophy and mathematics. It is this distance, this uprooting sometimes, that guarantees the possible work of philosophy, and in particular, the philosophical work that is not a simple accompanying injunction from mathematics. In other words, philosophy must think outside mathematics and elaborate its own questions. This is not easy if one wants to keep an intimate and necessary contact with mathematics, especially mathematics in agenda, a contact from within that does not take mathematics as a simple object of observation. The right posture, it seems to me, is that of doing philosophy in the shadow of mathematics, choosing its place, one's place, adapting to it to reveal subtle reliefs and connections. We have spoken of many connections. It is a posture that does not suppose that philosophy and mathematics are linked, that there are natural contacts, that mathematics contains philosophy within itself, or even that there is something, sometimes a wind of a philosophy rising each time you do mathematics. I mean, proof theorems, and that it would be enough to catch on the fly. In the shadow of mathematics, it is first of all a question of absolute independence. But this space of choice still needs to be clarified. And this is what I will try to show with some of Grothendieck's work today. Let's clarify a little more what I think is essential to avoid. Two problems can be distinguished. First, the first one consists in obfuscating the philosophical scene by placing it under the entirety of mathematics, overhanging all philosophy. The second problem, which is closely associated with it, is that of the dazzle caused by mathematics, impressive mathematics, beautiful mathematics, enlightened mathematics, etc. In both cases, the effect is one of great obscurity. Here, the Grothendieck case is, in my opinion, eloquent. The Grothendieck case poses the general problem of geniuses, of revolutions, of novelties that would change everything, that would forever, in fact, the mathematical landscape and change the paradigm. Under this vocabulary, macabre shadow is cast that is not conducive to philosophy. It is the shadow of a walnut tree, the Salon des Dames aux Sorcières, as we say in French, where it is said that one can die because it is so dense. Apart from the evocation that of what I've just mentioned, genius, revolution, etc., a tempting way of putting oneself too much in the shadow of mathematics is to hide behind a technical presentation which shows that one has mastered the subject well. The temptation is great when reading Grothendieck to start doing mathematics, or in the slightly less glamorous version, to make a presentation of mathematical glosses whose only objective is to show the mathematical virtuosity of the person who would in fact like to do philosophy. Let there be no mistake about what I'm saying. I'm proposing both intimate contact and independence, particularly concerning intimacy. It seems to me that a philosophy of mathematics must keep a descriptive aspect. And here, descriptive is not at all opposed to conceptual. On the contrary, it is the absolute condition for intimate contact. But on the other hand, I defend that this is compatible with an independent philosophy, that is to say, that one that elaborates its own questions, or more precisely, such that the question of philosophy of mathematics makes sense outside of mathematics. So to work in the shadow of mathematics is to have a philosophical project independent of mathematics, a necessary autonomization to make a philosophy of mathematics while remaining in intimate contact with mathematics. It is therefore necessary to choose with great care the branches of mathematics under which one wishes to work, neither too little mathematics, nor too many branches. I come now to Grothendieck. My aim is not to develop a complete Grothendieck philosophy here, but to show how one can choose to work in the shadow of Grothendieck's mathematics. So my objective, which is very partial, will be to show how one can think important and autonomous philosophical questions in contact with Grothendieck's work. We have happily seen that this is possible in several presentations in this conference, and I will therefore highlight, without necessarily organizing them in a large compound picture, a certain number of philosophical questions that Grothendieck's works makes it possible to rethink, and there will always be a link with the necessity that I recall at the beginning, to think about the progression of mathematics and the conditions that make it possible. I'm going to focus on a part of Grothendieck's work, which is not the most extensive, but which has the interest of being situated at the beginning of his career. Therefore, at the time when the Grothendieck rocket has not yet taken off into space, where there is still in the process of reading itself of a kind of mathematical gravity of a very palpable and sticky history. To be precise, I'm going to go through a few points that seem important to me in Grothendieck's work on functional analysis, to try to make you feel a little of the philosophical interest, that is to say, how these games of chosen shadows lead to a possibility for philosophy. I won't go much further into philosophical ideas, and I hope that this will be enough to make you imagine the philosophical potential that I see in it. Let's put now things into context. I have the chance to speak after Fernando, for example, and many others who have already said some very interesting things on the subject. At the beginning of his career, Grothendieck was in contact with Dieudonné and Schwartz. Officially, Schwartz was his PhD director, and I would add that Schwartz would also be the PhD director some 20 years later of a certain Gilles Pizier, a great name in the functional analysis. Moreover, what I will say here will be not only in the shadow of Grothendieck, but also in the shadow of Pizier's mathematics, of which you can find an important text in the volume that I have edited entitled Lecture Grothendieckien. maybe I come back to that. There is a book here, and you can. Some people here are participating in this book, and you can see it and circulate it. Okay. Grothendieck's thesis is dedicated to tensor product of topological vector spaces and nuclear spaces. It should be remembered that here that Schwarz proved in 1950 a kernel theorem on tensor product of spaces of distributions, where a certain number of problems linked to tensor products are highlighted. Schwarz theory is linked to measure theory, tensor products of measures, and integrals with parameters. With Grothendieck, we'll see at work a search for a general framework to tackle and understand or re-understand these problems. For Grothendieck, a strategy for progressing towards the general involves first and foremost understanding what is at stake. This is something that could be said to be common to all mathematical activity, in fact, but it is expressed in various ways. We can remember this sentence of Grothendieck, which is extracted from Récolte et Semaille. It's in French here, I translate. None of the great theorems would be demonstrated at the present time, although this was by no means my main concern, if during these 15 years I had not obstinately followed a passion for understanding within me, trusting the mode of approach it dictated to me, whether or not it was profitable in terms of such or such desiderata, or whether or not it was well seen in the high society, the grand monde. This approach consisted each time in starting with a strong intuition or a handful of such intuitions and taking them as solid and fruitful thread that pulled me into the unknown. Grothendieck wrote his thesis in the continuity of Schwarz, as I said. It was published in a large AMS dissertation in 2 chapters. The first is dedicated to a general theory of topological tensor products, and the second one to the theory of nuclear spaces. So maybe I have the reference here. In 1953, Grothendieck published a well-known paper entitled Résumé de la théorie métrique des produits tensoriels topologiques, as you can see. And the word résumé is a bit misleading because there are, in fact, 2 résumés around this period. The first is a summary of the thesis published in the Annales de l'Institut Fourier in Grenoble in 1952, when the AMS thesis had not been yet published, was published in 1955. In this summary, in the strict sense of the thesis, Grothendieck specifies a number of points that are important for understanding the progression of mathematics. We call this resume number 1 because it's linked to the PhD. I summarize some ideas here. So, first, the notion of topological tensor products is the basis of a good general and simple formulation of the Fredon theory, encompassing in addition the classical case of an integral operator defined by a continuous kernel. The second point, there are 4 of them. The various variants of the notion of topological tensor product give rise by duality. This is very important, this word of duality here in Grothendieck's work, to the definition of as many remarkable classes of bilinear forms and linear operators. We'll come back to those elements here. From the point of view of current work, the most important application of topological tensor product is the theory of nuclear spaces. Here, the famous kernel theorem of Schwarz is explained, generalized in an extensive way, and refined at the same time, and new properties are found even in the most classical spaces. Here, the topological tensor calculus takes on its maximum simplicity because most of the variants of the notion of topological tensor products coincide, and their properties are consequently combined. For the moment, the applications of the general theorem we obtain to particular theories are not yet numerous. And the last one, in general, it seems to me that the notion of topological tensor product are well suited to provide a suggestive and manageable language which has interest to be used in many situations in functional analysis, especially since we have at our disposal theorems, some of them non-trivial, to take advantage of this language. So those are quotes from the first resume, so from, you can say, from the PhD. Yeah, I would like to underline a number of important points that are stated in these those quotations. Very simple terms, in fact. Generality obtained as a generalization. Duality, I've mentioned duality as a means of progression, using the power of a general theory to better understand classical situations. But if the objective is to put oneself in the shade of some mathematics, Grothendieck's comments, however enlightening on his own work, are not enough. We still have to choose the branches under which we can think philosophically. That what will interest me now in the second summary, published in São Paulo, entitled Résumé de la théorie métrique des produits tensoriels topologiques. And I will go through it, highlighting some notion and showing how philosophical ideas are illuminated in a new way, in a new light, when worked on in the shade of Grothendieck's mathematics. I will therefore focus on a few themes, which will be generality, dialectical pairs such as finite, infinite, and the link between algebraic structures and geometry. And when I say geometry, it's maybe a bit too much. I know that Grothendieck uses geometry, but I would say distance only, very specific one. The resume, number 2, we are talking about is an article that is not very well known. The thesis dated, as I've said, 53. It will be published in 56. The volume dated is dated 53. And nevertheless, it contains another paper by Grothendieck dated 54. So Grothendieck, who was still working, felt the need to publish his results. I said that the article is not very well known, or at least that it would take a long time to be read, despite a presentation by Cartier to Bourbaki in 61, who understood the importance of what is contained and the subtle evolution with the thesis. In fact, to be precise, there are 2 articles by Grothendieck that follow each other in the São Paulo publication, and a real evolution with respect to the PhD. I would like to take here the opportunity to point out that the Brazilians have had a very interesting initiative in republishing in a modern way a certain number of texts that have tended to be forgotten in a journal called Resenhas. Starting in 2007, the publication was continued under the name of São Paulo Journal of Mathematical Sciences. And the SMF, La Société Mathématique de France, is also trying to do this by republishing texts that have become difficult to access. This is very important, and I don't know if the AMS is doing the same, but it's quite a good thing. Let me come back to the title. So maybe I'll start with the title here. As you can read on the OHP slide, the title has evolved. It seems towards less generality. So we have to understand what Grothendieck is doing since his thesis. To understand him well, I recall that what a locally convex space is, and then a nuclear space. A locally convex space is defined either in terms of convex sets or equivalently in terms of seminorms. A topological space, vector space, is called locally convex if the origin has a neighborhood basis that is a local base consisting of convex sets. A locally convex space is defined to be a vector space X along with a family P of seminorms on X. A family of seminorms on the vector space induces a canonical vector space topology on X called the initial topology induced by the seminorms, making it into a topological vector space. Any norms vector space is locally convex topology defined by a single seminorm, the norm. The weak topology of a topological space is locally convex. Just use the continuous linear forms in module as a family of seminorms. I'll now give you a definition of a nuclear space, which is close to the definition given by Grothendieck. There are other definitions with the seminorms, but you will see a bit later on why I decided to stick to this definition. I let you read the definition here. My point here is not that you remember the definition for later evaluation, but just to measure that it is quite a demanding definition if you see it for the first time. In the second resume, Grothendieck therefore dropped the locally convex to concentrate on Banach space. Banach in the title here is hidden under metric. Okay, and there is no more topological spaces here. In fact, the important fact that Grothendieck was aware of is that the operators between Banach spaces are the key of all the mechanics that has been developed in the locally convex case. So now I'm going to grasp a few philosophical ideas. So maybe here you can think something like towards simplicity. Like what I recall in the first quotation from Grothendieck, there is here a desire to understand and account for the simplicity of things. Grothendieck will say, it's the resume again, it may even be noted that the theory of topological tensor products of general locally convex spaces gains in clarity and simplicity from being first stated for Banach spaces. Indeed, a reading of my thesis will show that almost all questions in general theory, including the theory of nuclear spaces, actually boils down to question about Banach spaces. So there is first a movement in the progression of mathematics that we read here. First towards a greater generality, that is of locally convex spaces, and then a progressive return to an understanding of the key mechanisms in a simpler framework, that of Banach spaces. In a way, the game instituted with more flexible rules is not fundamentally better than the game subject to the rules imposed by the Banach framework. At least the more general approach contains mechanisms of thought that are better captured in a more restricted framework in terms of generality. From a philosophical point of view, and if we try to understand the conditions that make the progression of mathematics possible, we see a first phenomenon of loosening the rule, passage to locally convex, an attempt to play with those new rules, and then a new modification of the rule, passage to Banach, where the game already seems to contain many of the subtleties that we thought we would gain by extending the rule. This move is accompanied by simplicity. If you look at the definition I mentioned ago, and if you're not familiar with them, you can see that we require a bit of concentration to get used to. On the contrary, in the resume number 2, Grothendieck's introduction is based on extremely simple definitions, close to those used by Banach himself. I remind you that Banach introduced the spaces that bear his name in his thesis in 1919, was published in French in 1920, and that between 1927 and 1932, 1932 is the time of his book, he published a number of texts on functional duality, weak topologies, etc. I will again, in the following pages, compare Banach and Grothendieck. Now I will focus on the relation to finite dimension. What can bring Banach and Grothendieck together in a less anecdotal way is a connection with the finite in a purely infinite context, because Banach spaces are designed to deal with infinite spaces, with in mind, in Banach as in Grothendieck, spaces of functions. This is, in a way, what justifies the term functional analysis, which is attributed to the works of this type. I will explain why I'm bringing the two mathematicians together without going into too much details. In fact, I've shown in a recent work that Banach implemented strategies based on a vision of constructive space linked to a finite dimension, then to separability. You probably have in mind in the proof of the extension theorem of functionals, you have this theorem in mind, but it is also the case in the whole process of treating functionals, which leads to the use of weak topologies. So one could have a fantasy that Grothendieck will place himself at another point of view, much more general and synthetic. But in fact, this is not the case. Once again, there is a constructive approach based on the finite dimension here, and this is done throughout more than 60 pages of dense mathematics. And I'm not going to review all the important moments at the heart of Grothendieck's progression, where this reliance on finite dimension is essential. I will summarize this in two key ideas. The first one I want to come back to is to think that thanks to a tensor product of operator of finite ranks. The second idea is actually a general strategy. One of Grothendieck's objectives is to compare norms and establish inequalities. And he will use a strategy which consists in establishing an inequality which depends on the dimension before giving an asymptotic version by making the dimension tend to infinity. I will first return to a finite dimension and tensor product. And in fact, if I have brought Grothendieck and Banach together in the first place, I will show that Grothendieck has its own approach, which will first of all involve three elements: continuous linear operators between two spaces, bilinear forms, and tensor products. The subtlety consists in playing with the links between these three elements, which seems to be of different natures. And it is the connection embodied in these mathematical elements that will interest us philosophically now. Maybe I can show you Grothendieck's text first. So I hope you can read that. I let you read the French here because there are lots of mathematics. So what is interesting is the different part of our identification. So if A is is a bilinear form acting on E times F, you can identify A with a linear application, as you can see in the last part of the code. And this is very important. So you can deal with linear operators by dealing with bilinear forms. Then there is a link between bilinear form and more concrete link between those bilinear form and operators. So if A is a bilinear form, you identify A with this application. So it's A dot X, okay? And so this is the application acting on Y. Finally, there is the intervention of the tensor product. So how is it linked to other ideas? Here. So E tensor F is the usual tensor product and generated by elements. So here Grothendieck goes back to very basic things, very important, and he does that even in Bourbaki when he talks about topology. He redefines what a topology is very often. So those are the open sets, and this works like that. And here he says that things that people know at that time. And maybe it's interesting to take a moment to understand what is happening here. So I've put a slide to explain that a bit more. So you have an application phi that goes from E prime, the dual of E, tensor product F, and going to the linear operators from E to F. And if you take L to be an element of E prime, that is a functional going from E to the field, and Y in F, then you send it to the application sending X, which is E, to L of X, which is a complex number, for example, Y, which is obviously an element in F. And this is what is very important. This is a linear injection, and the image of phi is exactly the operators of a finite one. Okay. Maybe I don't want to go further into the mathematical details that have become commonplace nowadays. What matters to me here is how there is a use of the finite dimension that is established with the tensor product. If we think here of the dialectic couple finite dimension, infinite dimension, we see that first is embodied in mathematical concepts, what, for example, Odman called schéma de liaison, pretty inspired by Kant schemata. Extending Lotzmann's ideas, we can think of the possibilities of passing from a diffuse, entangled, intuitive world of finite dimension to the well-detached world of the theory that deals with infinite dimension. Second point, these schémas de liaison are based on a strategy of progression that can be read in Grothendieck, and that naturally directs his intuition. I don't have time to say much more here, but nevertheless, I would like to note two more points of a more general philosophical nature. First, the progression of mathematics, as I shed light on it here, brings into play two types of realities. First, a diffuse one, where things are not detached from each other. For example, the notion of a normed vector space brings several things and a link to its base field, for example, and there are many things transported with those ideas. Finite dimension, etc., convey many unspoken things, situations shared by mathematicians, which are not necessarily identical according to places, environments, and times. The other thing, which is more in the domain of the detached object, detached from the subject, detached from any other notion, in this case, I think, of infinite spaces or operator spaces, for example, as defined in Grothendieck or even in Banach. The distinction I make here is linked to abstraction, but it does not coincide with the distinction made by abstraction, in fact. It seems to me that this non-symmetrical duality, which I place at the heart of the analysis of the progression of mathematics, can be found in analysis of the mathematical discourse, but also in analysis of the parallel discourse provided by Grothendieck, a language of objects which can be formalized, adapted to logical analysis, and a flexible language conveying other notions, a place not of vagueness, but of changing shadows. Stylistic analysis could profitably be carried out in Grothendieck's work if there were backed by a philosophical proposition, such as the one I propose to you here. I want to go back to the notion of norm, because it's very important. It's a crucial point in my talk. One of Grothendieck's major subject is the study of various norms on a Banach space. It is first a question of defining norms on tensor products, which Grothendieck describes as reasonable. So there is the reasonable here. The reasonable, in fact, is added to the simple. So what is a reasonable norm? So as you can see, you have two Banach spaces, and you construct a norm you have a norm on E tensor F, and it is reasonable if the bilinear application sending X and Y to the tensor product is of norm less than 1. And Grothendieck will designate by E tensor F with the alpha on top of the cross product to designate the completion of the tensor product for a reasonable norm. Among those norms, there is a larger and a smaller one, noted with a V or hat in Grothendieck, like that. So you can see the definition of those norms here. I don't want to spend time on reading those, and you can just grasp the ideas and the notations here. Norms will come into play in various ways in the landscape Grothendieck draws up. First, we can illustrate here what I mentioned as a strategy based on a finite dimension. Grothendieck will define norms on spaces that are tensor products of finite dimension. Then, by a passage through the limit, he will define the norm for a tensor product. This passage illustrates how mathematical progressions can be based on the notion of notions accessible in finite dimension. There are other related aspects that I will show a bit later. But first, let's look at what I'm saying about those limits. So you can read that you consider finite dimension, and it is growing, and you take the infimum of these norms to construct a norm. Okay. I do not have time to go further into this now, and I hope that you have been able to grasp the important things and the important aspects here. What I would like to show is another aspect, which is that very important in Grothendieck, and that is the link that can be made between metric aspects, comparison of norms, for example, or existence of isometries, and structural aspects, existence of invariant spaces, characterization of Hilbert spaces, morphisms. It will be also the occasion to talk about what Grothendieck himself calls the fundamental theorem in this text. So, comparison of norms and structures. I would like to start this part of my talk by coming back to something that seems very important to me, which is the fact that the theory of Banach spaces that Grothendieck proposes is intimately linked to something else, to what I have already called a diffuse entangled world that contaminates the objectified discourse and the statement where only the pure notion of Banach spaces would be in play. I have already shown by studying Banach work, when he gives a list of axioms defining the complete norm vector spaces, that in doing so, he establishes a link between two worlds, that of the objects favorable to an analysis in terms of logical symbols, and a diffuse world of mathematical beings, such as the reals, spaces of functions with multiple properties, etc. A certain number of things which completely overflow the rigorous framework of Banach spaces and which come to parasitize the latter, for the better, of course, in Banach. In Grothendieck, this type of link with the diffuse world can be found through the important presence of special spaces, for example, and several other places, but this is quite interesting to see special spaces. Basically, they are continuous functions, LP spaces, and the Hilbert space. So to denote the spaces, we put it underlines the letter. So when you see an H with an underlined H, it means one Hilbert space, and it's exactly the same for C and for L here. These spaces will allow Grothendieck to give general statements thanks to the notation it uses, and underlined letter meaning the type of space, as I've said. Among these spaces, the Hilbert space holds an important place, and we will find it at the center of many sections in Grothendieck's work. So maybe I can show you the list of chapters here, and you can see the work on norms and the importance of the Hilbert space. Grothendieck will use a certain number of results to give a classification of continuous linear application between these spaces. And maybe there's another, this is the one I want to see. Okay. Maybe to finish, I will come to the relationship between metric or geometry and structure. A point which seems to me to be a matter of general philosophy, and which benefits from being enlightened by mathematics, here those of Grothendieck. It's all in the characterization of Hilbert spaces. There are in fact two notions, one vectorial and the other metric, which are embedded in the concept of Hilbert space. On one hand, there is a notion of Hilbert basis, and on the other hand, the metric, resulting from the scalar product, which makes the Hilbert space a Banach space. The two are intimately linked. Two spaces which have equivalent bases are isometrically isomorphic. And an important result of Grothendieck gives an equivalence which characterizes Hilbert spaces in terms which are not isometric isomorphism, but comparisons of structures. So when you look at this proposition here, this is an equivalence between different things. And the first one is the norm is equivalent to a Hilbertian norm. And the last one says that H is isomorphic at the same time to a quotient of a space of type C and to a subspace of a space of type L. And so this is one characterization of Hilbert spaces based just on structures and not on metric things. I have how many minutes left? Five, 2, 3 would be better. Okay. I take your first answer. Okay. Maybe I am going to end this presentation by defending a little more the idea I put forward in the introduction, and particularly by clarifying key points. The links here in between metrics and structural aspects are subtle. They are not totally. When you define a vector Banach space, for example, at the same time you have a structure, an algebraic structure, and you have a norm, and you say, okay, this is a whole thing, and I have a Banach space. But in fact, this is not a whole thing. There is an interplay between the norm and the algebraic structure. And from this interplay, there are things that are new and that are not captured just by saying that you have a new structure that is a Banach space. That's it. And maybe I finish with another example. about the link between these structures, algebraic structures, and the norm. This is about, for example, reflexivity. So reflexivity or even hyperreflexivity. Those two notions, I do not have time to redefine them, might be seen as question of distance between the distance between operator and an algebra of operators. Okay, and there are several distances, and to compare those distances, say something about the structure of the algebra of operators, and this kind of link between something that is metric in, for example, the comparison of norms, equivalence of norms, and something that is totally something about the algebraic structure or the equivalence of different spaces is something that is captures in different parts of mathematics and quite important, I think. Okay, I stop here. Thank you very much.